Welcome to Hemispheres. This is Zawdie Ekundayo. I'm sitting here tonight with Richard Curtis, the chair of the Colorado District Communist Party, USA. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Zawdie.
You had scheduled a guest tonight. Who was that?
That was Mairead Keane
And the subject was to be...
of Sinn Féin.
And we were going to talk about the troubles in Ireland.
But we're having a little trouble getting a hold of
A
her.
little trouble. So we're improvising here. And that's okay. Richard, I lived in Atlanta for a million years ago, and was a fellow traveler with the Revolutionary Communist Party there. Part of what I came to see among the communists were so many internecine struggles that kept them from being in any way united. But some of the issues I have never been able to resolve for my own satisfaction. That has to do with the role of unions in the communist movement, or the movement toward communism in this country. Can you help sort out what the debate is about?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. That the idea that comes out of the socialist movements, especially from Europe in the mid-19th century, is that workers in big industries, which were just forming at that time, formed the basis of the working class. That they were the people who had come off of the farms, the former peasants, and were now working for a wage, working for a capitalist, for an owner of a factory. And thus, those people had an experience of life, which allowed them to see, number one, that exploitation of labor by capital was inherently bad and was destructive to society, but further and more importantly, that it was possible to organize society around the interests of themselves, them, the working class, being the majority, organizing society around their interests, socializing the means of production, socializing the factories, so that the ownership of them was in the hands of everybody and not just an elite few.
What are the different positions held by the different factions of communists in this country?
Well, I think communists, people who would use that name, and I don't have experience with the Revolutionary Communist Party other than a little bit that I've read in the news. I understand there was a big crackdown in New York City a couple months ago, and a number of people were arrested for arms violations. So the Revolutionary Communist Party is a different animal than the Communist Party USA. The Communist Party USA being one of the sister organizations with what are generally known as workers' parties or communist parties in other parts of the world, coming out of the philosophical tradition of Marx and of Vladimir Lenin from Russia. There is some dissension among socialists, communists being one kind of socialist, about the role of industrial workers, the place of industrial workers, especially in modern industrial countries which are fast becoming deindustrialized, with heavy industry having moved to the third world where wages can be suppressed and profits are therefore greater. So if those industrial workers and their trade unions, and the communists have always put a strong emphasis on the organizational value of trade unions, if all of that is declining, there are some who call themselves socialists who say we need to rethink the mechanisms by which we would make a revolutionary transformation of society and put the emphasis on a larger portion of the working class. There are some who call themselves socialists that don't use the term class that much, that don't actually see the value in understanding society in terms of owning and not owning. My impression is that in the late 1990s, that some of those attitudes from the 70s and 80s about class and the significance of class are fast fading away, and we're returning to the more traditional understanding of class. You see people today talking, for example, about corporations and corporate power and how to address corporate power. Well, if you talk about corporate power, you're talking about class power, because corporations are, in fact, owned by a particular segment of society.
The concern I've heard and want to explore has to do with the ability of the capitalists, however they might form themselves, to co-opt the workers. Some would argue, and this is an old argument, I suppose it was old when I heard it, that the workers, particularly unions, can be manipulated by the capitalists to cooperate in the exploitation of other workers, not just other workers outside the country, which is clear and more obvious, but also workers within the one country. What is the debate? I don't quite understand it.
And then also, I'm not quite sure exactly what you're referring to, but the operative problem in socialist circles, around the world, is a question of class consciousness, which means the degree to which an individual recognizes their participation in a particular class. And this is not new. This is something that Marx himself wrote about in the mid-19th century. Co-opting, and there is a certain sense in which we all workers are co-opted to the degree that we agree to participate in the system. Now, it is also true in many of the industrialized countries here and as well as in Europe that unions have at times given up any struggle for equality with the capitalist class and have sort of accepted their position and have then brokered working people to owners. This comes up in America. I think people probably might recall the way the Teamsters used to run, and the Teamsters are going through a dramatic change with new leadership and formation in the Teamsters called Teamsters for a Democratic Union, TDU. And there are some who suggest that this position that the Teamsters took of not struggling for revolutionary change in society, or not even understanding themselves as having that role, that a lot of that is connected to infiltration activity in the 1950s, where the government forces, and I've read particular exposés that mention the FBI, in steering the direction that the leadership of the big industrial unions in this country took, including the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters. The AFL-CIO, I might mention, is also going through a similar kind of transformation right now as it moves towards engaging in political struggle, where for many years during the Cold War, the AFL-CIO bought in wholeheartedly to the Cold War myth that the Soviet Union was somehow an enemy of ordinary Americans. Now, obviously, as a communist in particular, and as a socialist in general, I would disagree with that analysis, and in fact see that the Soviet Union was an ally of working people, may not have been organized in exactly the same way that Americans would organize a socialist America, and quite certainly not, because they have a very different history. But working people in this country and their leaders in the forms of union leaders did buy into some of that argument, and some of those people got rich leading big unions, and we get all of these stories that have come out about corruption in the big unions and about the dangers of big labor because it is sort of bought off. Now, in the 1990s, especially the late 1990s, I think that phenomenon in particular is changing, and we see it most dramatically in the AFL-CIO and its changes in leadership, the TDU, and also the recently formed Labor Party, which is seeking to bring unions, trade unionists in particular, together as a voting bloc in an alternative to the Democratic Party. And we'll have to see how far that really goes. They haven't actually decided when or how they would engage political struggle in the ballot box, but are definitely intending to engage the world politically.
Another source of conflict among those on the left who call themselves socialists in general, and I suppose communists in general, is the historical perspective one might take on Stalin and Mao. What are those differences, the divisions that exist among communists on the issue of the role of Stalin and how he should be seen historically?
Well, I think that Stalin did a number of bad things.
Okay.
And it's a matter of the degree to which one looks at the historical reality of what was going on in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And it is certainly true that many people in Russia, you see them in news photos, they think of Stalin and Stalin's time with some regard, because it was a period of great economic growth in their economy, and people generally started to do better and to see more of the day-to-day benefits of the revolution. Then the other side of that is the paranoia that came along with Stalin's time, which was mirrored in our country with McCarthyism, although because of the situation and probably a lot of the history of Russia and its lack of democratic traditions, that paranoia took on real monstrous proportions at times.
And Mao, the view of Mao, how are the divisions sort of manifested?
Well, different. There are different branches, I guess, of the socialist movement around the world, and perhaps three main divisions.
Okay.
One being Leninist, one being Maoist, and the other being Euro-communist, the social democratic movements. Mao, being that I come out of the Leninist tradition, I'm not especially versed on Mao. And it's been my opinion generally, although people in this country have disagreed, that what Mao was about and what the genius of his political organizing was applicable in an agrarian pre-industrial society like China, where those conditions are obviously not existing in this country any longer. It probably goes a long way also to explaining why some revolutionary movements in the Third World, like the Shining Path, being probably the most well-known in Peru, adopt a Maoist model as opposed to a Leninist model because of the conditions, the rural conditions in Peru, which are also changing now too.
So these three larger divisions within the socialist movement sort of are manifested on the issue of Mao and Stalin, as well as the role of the unions or union leaders in the revolution somehow.
Well, Mao and Lenin, really. Stalin being a Leninist of sorts. You know, I think it's one thing that people don't often, I think, realize when we talk about socialism and what socialism might mean for the United States is, you know, we have this myth that somehow socialism needs to be like Stalin, you know, that there needs to be a heavy hand and secret police and all of that, and that's not something that the Communist Party in this country or the Communist parties in Europe have ever thought was necessary or have advocated. It's just a caricature that's been imposed on the vision in order to discredit it. In the United States, we have this 200-year tradition of democracy, bourgeois democracy dominated by property and property interests, so that the wealthy actually end up running the country in spite of having some formal procedures for actually polling people to find out what ordinary people think. But the Communist Party in this country puts a great deal of emphasis on the Constitution and the value of the Constitution, and seeing the Constitution itself as a vehicle for asserting the rights and interests of ordinary people, of working people.
So they've abandoned the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat?
Well, the dictatorship of the proletariat simply means that the class that is in charge rules without compromise. And I would say that we live under the dictatorship of the capitalists, with the limited democratic form. So a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of workers, would be the translation of power from owners to workers, but the work inside the working class, inside the mechanisms of working class government, we would take advantage of all of this democratic tradition that we've grown up with. But the dictatorship of the proletariat in America would mean no compromise on property issues. No sympathy for owners.
State ownership of the means of production.
Well, collective ownership, state being an abstraction of the collective of the whole people. The state is simply a mechanism for administering affairs. So it's a matter of the state being a real and genuine advocate for the class interests of everyone, of working people.
Okay, so we get these large divisions among socialists on at least three issues we've touched on so far. That is the role of the unions, the historical perspective taken to Lenin and Mao and Stalin, and this third one that I hear echoes of as we begin to speak further is on the goals of revolution, and I put that in quotes here. What are the differences among socialists on goals?
Well, before I get to that, I might point out that this question of the unions and the role of unions is one of the things that defines those three major branches that I talked about: Leninist, Maoist, and Euro-communist. With the Euro-communist model, which is in this country represented by Democratic Socialists of America, who are a faction really inside the Democratic Party. It's not an independent party. The Euro-communists don't put the same heavy emphasis on the role of unions as an organizing tool and as an important mechanism for democracy. That's something that the communists, both kinds of communists, the Maoist communists and Leninist communists, would do. But as far as goals, inasmuch as all people who call themselves socialists share that vision, socialism, we all have the same goals, which is equality and justice.
I'm stifling a laugh here for some reason. I'm not
Does that sound like a cliche?
Oh, yes, a hackneyed cliche.
Oh, jeez. And before when we were talking, you were accusing me of doing mediocre things. No, well, I understand. But the idea is that private ownership, private control in society of wealth, especially masses of wealth, like factories and huge industrial farms and things like that, that ownership is what defines inequality. So when I say equality, that's really it's not just a cliche, it really is a loaded political term, which in socialist vision means doing away with private property.
And all three factions of the communist movement or socialist movement agree on the same goals, that is to do away with private property.
Indeed.
And what happens after that, though? There was a critique developed, I'm not sure, Digelis, I think is his name, that came about after people saw the kind of ownership represented by Stalinist Russia. That is to say, where you have a small group of people, party members, who have control over the means of production in the name of the people, but somehow that control translated into ownership.
Well, I'm not sure that's true.
Okay.
I mean, certainly that that sort of standard cliche criticism of the Soviet Union is that because people had positions of power in the party and the state, that somehow they were equal to owners, and I would
more equal than the working class.
Well, no, I would categorically deny that equation. That because one is in a position of responsibility does not mean that they are equal with owners in the capitalist sense. I mean, certainly in a world which requires the maintenance of state apparatus, and ultimately all socialists would share a vision of someday doing away with the necessity for states, for countries in the world, but that certainly wasn't true during the Cold War. It was very necessary for the Soviet Union to maintain itself as a state, and indeed to arm itself very heavily to defend itself from our aggressions. So people have to have, you have people who are running things, and there are leaders who are chosen by people to represent them sort of full-time while they're doing day-to-day things. It's a
Hmm.
little division of responsibility that we eventually want to eliminate over time, but that's not something that can be done in a world of nation-states.
And
Now, you hem and haw a little when I talk about the Soviet Union defending itself from our aggressions.
yes.
That's another sort of interesting myth. Actually, if you look at even the CIA now confesses that the Soviet Union never developed an offensive capability in its military. And anytime it engaged in a military buildup, it was in direct response to a buildup from the United States. And there are a number of people who've written on this. There's a great book by a guy named Kaplan called Dubious Spectre that looks at this very issue and analyzes all of the data. And it's a complete lie that American people were fed in order to make them feel like they should be afraid of the Soviet Union, and somehow socialism was a threat to ordinary people. And that's completely the opposite of what's true. But you would expect that to happen, wouldn't you, in a society that is divided by class, in which the rich are oppressing the poor? It's important for the workers, for poor people, ordinary people, to feel like any solidarity they would have with others around the world, especially if those others happen to have state power, to think that they're different, that they don't share a common goal, that they aren't working together, to side with the capitalists against socialism in the world.
So the Soviet Union arming various factions in the Third World for the takeover of power was actually a defensive action.
Oh, I don't know that that was a defensive action, but it's an act of solidarity. And when the Soviet Union provides aid to the FMLN in El Salvador, they are supporting other working people who are conducting the same sort of revolution that they conducted.
Mm-hmm. And Pol Pot in Vietnam?
Was supported, Pol Pot in Cambodia, was supported by the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was the Vietnamese who overthrew Pol Pot. Pol Pot was actually Maoist, Vietnamese being Leninist. But after the Vietnam War in 1979, the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia because the United States had been encouraging and arming and helping organize Pol Pot in his genocidal campaign of terror in Cambodia, which was spreading into Vietnam.
I'm trying to focus again on the divisions among socialists and where those points of divisions lie.
Well, the biggest division would be between what in this country we call democratic socialists and what we call communists. Mm-hmm. And it's the question of revolutionary transformation. The Euro-communist model, also known as the social democratic model today, although that particular term has different uses at different periods in history, but in America in the late 1990s, mm-hmm. social democratic, that line advocates a gradual transformation mm-hmm. of society.
Evolutionary.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And to that, communists would simply point out what's been happening around the world in the late 1990s, that, in formerly wealthy industrial countries, jobs are moving overseas. There's record poverty, record disparities of wealth between the rich and poor.
So there's no time for evolution? Is that the argument?
Well, it's not a matter of time. It's that one is deceiving oneself to believe that the capitalist class would allow a gradual transformation. That as long as they have the power, they will exploit that power to the greatest extent possible for the greatest profit.
I see us approaching another one of those divisions among the socialists, and that is the role of armed struggle in revolution, or the necessity of armed struggle. Where are the positions on that? The Euro-communists, I guess, would disavow any necessity for armed struggle.
Well, in their own countries, certainly. A lot of in Europe and in here, but a lot of people who would come down on the Euro-communist side also support Cuba, mm-hmm. and wouldn't disparage Cuba, the necessity of armed struggle in its revolution in 1959. And the Communist Party USA in this country would not deny armed struggle if it were necessary, but we don't see that as necessary or helpful in the American context, and that's also true of most of the communist parties in the developed world.
So there are divisions over the role of unions, over sort of historical perspectives on Mao, Stalin, Lenin, but the communists or the socialists we see in the West all agree armed struggle is not necessary
Not necessary, indeed.
in the West.
Right. And that's just a historical reality, as opposed to a principled stance. Now, there are certainly some socialists and the Euro-communists among them, and there are also religious socialists, and Christian socialists and Buddhist socialists, who would, as a matter of principle, not engage in armed struggle as a moral principle. Now, that also gets very interesting because there are also Christian socialists who have taken up arms. The liberation theology model I'm thinking of in particular out of Latin America. And there are very heated and protracted discussions among theologians about this very question of armed struggle. And there are some very prominent names who would argue that Christian love requires armed struggle if the oppression is that great. And then there are others who make almost the same argument that Christian love requires forgiveness and therefore a more patient approach.
We're going to take callers now. You can join us on this discussion of the various factions of the Communist Party or Socialist Movement.
The Socialist Movement.
Socialist Movement, okay. Or on almost any other subject. Please join us. Do we have a call?
No. I think that means you have to ask another question.
Aha. In the third world, there are divisions as well among different factions of socialists, and their goals are also different, though. It seems there's been a heated debate over, well, watching the Soviet Union become what many call state capitalists before this recent turn, and others who, well, those who disparage that movement from, well, of course they don't disparage the movement from private ownership to some collective form of ownership, but the movement from private to state ownership seems to be a dividing line. What's your sense of what those debates are about among those socialists?
Well, it's often phrased in very lofty moral and ethical terms, because it is certainly true that in a state context, like the Soviet Union, collective ownership can itself seem other and alien, and therefore the relationship between the worker and the collective that owns the factory can in some ways be analogous to the relationship between a worker and an owner. Although worker under socialism obviously has more or less say depending on how well they're actually doing it. And that would be where the communist version of events or interpretations of the necessities of history would come in seeing that the movement from capitalism to socialism is a relatively complicated thing that can't be done overnight. And state ownership in a world of nation states is a necessary part of that transformation. Some in Marx's own time, this debate was known as a debate between utopian socialists and scientific socialists. Utopian socialists wanting really a move from from capitalism to what is known as communism. Communism being the ultimate expression of socialism, in which the state has, in Marxist terms, withered away, and that there is just this sort of nebulous but organic coordination of society without hierarchical structures. That's the socialism that everyone agrees on. The question is, how do you actually get there?
Yeah, nebulous
that would be
organic.
The harder part. That in a society that's very rigid and hierarchical, such as capitalist society, to move from that to complete lack of hierarchy is not something that could be done overnight without a lot of people starving. So it's necessary to have some order in society, and for that transition to happen over time. In a Cold War situation with the Soviet Union, that development, that progress towards the communist ideal is impeded by the necessity of national defense.
We're speaking here now in the context of the post-Cold War, and that seems like a subject that would divide the socialist movement, sort of what happened. I wouldn't think everyone agrees that on the same analysis. What are the various views of what happened with the Soviet Union?
Well, there are those from the social democratic schools of thought, the Euro-communist model, that would suggest that the failure of confidence that led to the fall of the Soviet Union was a direct result of the errors of scientific socialism, the error of believing that there was a necessity to having the state. The communist analysis would be that factors of life that manifest themselves in Cold War situation, the situation of being at war and having to maintain a state of readiness for war, including the allocation of simply ungodly resources towards military might to match the, even more ungodly resources that were devoted towards military might here, that drain on the economy actually caused the lack of confidence. And I might add, in the communist defense, that it's a sort of long-standing fact that American defense strategists, defense used in that their euphemistic sense of defense, envisioned exactly that sequence of events, that a Cold War would bankrupt socialist economies because they simply could not compete at the level that capitalist countries can in producing arms, because they owe a certain degree of subsistence, of a certain lifestyle to people, that people demand that in socialism. They expect certain things. They expect healthcare, they expect housing, they expect an education. Whereas in this country, those things are all disappearing and they are sacrificed to military, and we working people in this country haven't developed the power politically to challenge that.
You're listening to Hemispheres on KGNU. We're speaking tonight with Richard Curtis, the chair of the Colorado District Communist Party, USA.
Actually, Richard, this is Tom Shelley.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, how are you?
We might mention we have another Tom on a different line, so that Tom from Golden, please hold on a moment.
I was just listening in here and there to the show. I was driving my car, and last thing I heard you guys talking about was armed struggle in the West. And since we're actually coming up to Easter, I just sort of wanted to point out a couple things that actually the Easter uprising of 1916 in Ireland was actually mostly planned by James Connolly, who was a leading socialist at that time. And basically, I was wondering, do you think that the establishment, the upper class, would actually give up power completely peacefully, and what role could there be for armed struggle?
Well, it's certainly a difficult and very important question. I think, for my own part, that one would hope the capitalist class would give up power if they were to lose power democratically via elections in this country, and that armed struggle would not be necessary. Now, that may in fact not be true. So while I've said that armed struggle in the American context right now is not something that's under consideration, it's not practical, that does not mean that it may not come to that one day, and hopefully not.
One thing that I've thought of is the position of non-European peoples in this country, and I think significant parts of the European American left fail to realize what African Americans and Chicanos and Native Americans experience, and they really have experienced the same kind of repressive systems that we find in the third world.
Here you
It
mean.
seems almost logical to respond to those oppressive systems of death squads and etc. with self-defense and possibly also armed struggle.
Well, I think that was the direction that the Black Panther Party was moving in the 1960s, and having spoken with people who were activists at the time and heard some of the stories that they told, it certainly just seemed that we were much closer to that, that we were teetering on the edge of that open to armed conflict. And I know that even today in the United States there are groups that call themselves communists, the Revolutionary Communist Party, for one, that does think that armed struggle is called for in the immediate context. And with that, that I don't agree with that analysis of the present situation in 1997.
All right. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. We have Tom from Golden. This is a second Tom. Tom, do you have a question for Richard Curtis tonight?
Well, yes, I actually have two questions. These things seem to be kind of related. I'd like to get to my main question and then kind of feed on some things that Tom just said.
Tom, could you speak up just a bit?
Yes. I have a question insofar as has communism ever worked? In other words, when you are eliminating private property, you are actually depriving a lot of poor people of a means of subsistence. Maybe the state administrates these things with various degrees of efficiency, say, so that everyone sort of survives, but you actually have the power, the wealth, there's another name for it, capital, becomes monopolistic capitalism in that the state has by necessity, in a transition period, the state has to handle this. So what you end up with is a form of capitalism where the state is in total control of capital, and then whether they call themselves communist or not, are they going to get, it's like, okay, you can take everything from the poorer people and eliminate private property that way, but when the transition period is over, is the state going to actually ethically and fairly be part of sharing? People like to think communism is sharing, but it generally doesn't work that way because you have this power structure. And
Well, Tom,
it'd be nice to think we were all beautiful, loving, sharing people. Then it could conceivably work.
I guess I would ask you about your first comment that doing away with private property would somehow be to the detriment of working people or poor people. How is that possibly the case?
Well, see, what the problem seems to be is that we have an overwhelming amount of power in the hands of megalomaniac capitalists, but your average person is surviving. So, in a sense, theoretically, I don't have a problem with your average pro, your poor person, because the state's already taking away everything they have. They practically have no private property.
Well, wait, Tom, how is it that the state takes away things that poor people have if poor people, by definition, don't have anything because they're not being paid a decent wage by capitalists?
Yeah, I'm exaggerating, I agree, but
and see, actually,
poor people don't have a tremendous amount to lose, but I have this question, like, say you own something that may not be of real value, but it's of sentimental value, and does the state have a right to pretend that it's the people, and then you're deprived of even your sentimental possessions, and then everyone's living on some form of capital that's completely administrated by the state. I mean, we're making this transition toward socialism just because of the very nature of capital. It is happening.
Well, socialism...
But I'm not sure if it's really, there's some contradictions inherent in the process itself, as well as, no doubt, in the philosophy because of human nature.
Well, I might point out that personal property is not private property. A vase that you got from your grandmother, that's personal property. That's a different thing.
State won't take that.
No. Well, it doesn't have any interest in that.
But can you sell it? Can you make a business as an individual in a socialist system?
Well, the Cubans are doing that right now. I think that's a fairly detailed theoretical question that may not be appropriate to get into at this moment. But the distinction between personal property and private property has to do with huge farms, and not necessarily family farms, which can be viewed as personal property, and factories. So for the most part, major land holdings, apartment buildings, that's private property. Your house, that's personal property. Factory where General Motors makes cars, that's private property. So that distinction is something that has often been glossed over in capitalist society as a way of scaring working people into thinking that somehow, the meager possessions that they do have, that they have managed to acquire, the nice things that they may have, that somehow those are threatened with collective ownership, and that's entirely untrue and completely misleading. That people would even suggest that that's the case.
I see. That's the point you made earlier, that the real crisis would be when actually major capital agrees, to allow these things to be collectively run. In other words, major capital stands to lose their individualistic monopoly over a lot of functions. So yeah, I totally agree. That would be
and in response,
problem and a crisis for sure.
And in response to your question about the role of the state and what's been called state capitalism, that also I think is a distraction away from the truth. It's a way of confusing the point, because if the state is democratic in that it actually has working democratic mechanisms whereby ordinary people are participating in a system of governance, and that state controls the private property, the productive property in society, then you have democratic control, even if it is administered by, professionals at some level of government or whatever. But when those people are responsive to everyone in society, to ordinary people, then even in a situation where there is state-controlled socialism, that still is a giant leap in the direction of true socialism and real democracy.
I see what you mean, yeah. I mean, it theoretically is good, and I'd like to think that it could work without power structures developing that would actually, be major difficulties. I'd like to go back. I thought one of the focuses of this discussion was, at least Sean Fenn was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I was hoping actually to interview the U.S. representative of Sinn Féin.
Oh, no kidding.
And she failed to connect with me as anticipated, unfortunately. So we'll have to try and bring that to you in a later date.
Well, see, is Sean Fenn a nationalist group that is gaining communist revolutionary support, or let's say has had some ties with those support elements, because those elements felt that they could work it sort of as a functionary of socialism or communism, even though the driving force is actually nationalism.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not especially well versed, but from the research that I was doing to prepare for the show, I did discover that Sinn Féin does describe itself as a socialist party. I think that it puts the priority on the national struggle and national liberation, but it does have a socialist vision for a united Ireland.
I see. But their definition of socialism may or may not dovetail into what you're defining as communism.
It must be connected in some way because they talk about the same collective ownership. But that's something we'll have to wait for that interview and that's one of the questions I was hoping to ask.
Tom, thanks for your observations, and
Thank you very
please
kindly.
call us again.
I appreciate your thoughtful attention. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have Mark of Boulder. Do you have a question for Richard Curtis tonight, Mark? And an observation, perhaps?
Probably more of a question. It seems recently, probably within the last 10 years, that the communist economies really didn't come into full fruition. I was wondering, why would communism work in the United States? Granted, one, these apparent failures, and two, U.S. public sentiment.
Well, I would like to turn that question around and simply ask why would anyone think that capitalism can possibly work for very much longer, and socialism being the only other alternative way of organizing society? That we have a choice of a society that is stratified by wealth and violence and poverty and drugs and crime and lack of education, or we have an alternative of a collective cooperative society that can achieve great strides in human knowledge and human understanding. I might point out that just last year, the infant mortality rate for the country of Cuba, third world country, infant mortality rate in Cuba is now lower than the infant mortality rate for the United States.
Well, that's
because of socialist medicine.
Well, that's certainly a nice observation, but I wouldn't put Cuban medicine anywhere near the caliber of U.S. medicine.
No, it's the way that that medicine is distributed that is the issue.
Yeah, well, kind of to the core of it is I don't really see a good communist model existing anywhere in the world right now. And if there was one, it was the Soviet Union. And the stuff that really came out after the fall of the Soviet Union really was not too complimentary of what was going on in that country. So.
Well, that may be true, but we're talking about forging a new future. So there's a sense in which we're charting new water, and we have to kind of make it up as we go and learn from the lessons and the mistakes of the past and not repeat those mistakes.
But isn't communism a little bit too radical of something for the American public to ever swallow?
Well, the analysis that Marx had when he was writing, and it's 100 years ago, but I think it's fairly telling, is that people are, as you're suggesting, by and large relatively conservative, and that making radical changes in their lives without some sort of guarantee is the kind of thing that they need a serious motivation to do. And the thinking has always been in socialist circles is that change will be made when it has to be made. That when capitalism or people generally realize that capitalism is not capable of providing for social needs for the mass of people in the country or in the world, that is the point at which people will make a change.
Okay. I'm still not that I'm not seeing a model in terms of what we should be striving for and why it's going to be beneficial. And the other thing with communism that I think turns off an enormous amount of the population is their history of human rights abuses. I mean, what went down under Stalin in the Soviet Union is just, absolutely phenomenal of what happened. And Pol Pot, even if he was being supported by the U.S., was a communist government. What was happening was under a communist government.
Well,
what happened in China
is still
going on too.
Well, Mark, I would ask that you take an honest look around the world in the last 100 years, and I think that an honest look would tell you that anything that was happening in the socialist world was amateur compared to what we do. I mean, you want to talk about human rights abuses.
We're talking about millions and millions of people being killed in the Soviet Union.
Well,
that's never happened in the United States.
That's actually not the case. I mean, who told you that?
Yeah, you can talk about Native Americans and black rights and women's rights and a lot of things there's been difficulties about. But in the Soviet Union, people were being persecuted for being Jewish. I mean, outwardly prosecuted, kicked out of the... I mean,
Whereas
the
in
guy that won the
capitalist...
Nobel Prize there, after he won the Nobel Prize, what did? They stuck him up in Gorky Park.
Whereas in capitalist Germany, Jews were exterminated. So that's...
Not capitalist.
Fascism is a political expression of capitalism. I mean, it was a system of private ownership where the state was protecting large corporate interests. Fascism is a capitalist system. I mean, to pretend somehow that socialism is destructive or cruel. When you look around the world, it's simply not true and naive. I mean, the real barbarism in the world is conducted in the name of protecting private profit. I mean, look at what we did in Guatemala. It's incredible that our government, the CIA, helped the Guatemalans set up these camps where villages were determined to be either white, pink, or red, with red meaning they had serious left leanings, pink being they had minor left leanings, and white being fairly benign. And the pink villages, the people were relocated to concentration camps, in essence, and their villages were destroyed. The villages that were labeled as red, and there were some 70 of these during the 1980s, they were entirely destroyed from the air and then from the ground. Everyone in the village was killed, and the village was completely wiped off the map. You know, that nowhere in the socialist world has anything remotely like that happened.
Well, I would argue with anything remotely. I mean, how do you explain what happened under Stalin?
Oh, well, I'm not claiming what happened under Stalin was a good idea or that it's a necessary part of socialism. I'm claiming that a lot of what happened...
Bad.
No, I'm claiming a lot of what happened was a mistake, but that what Americans have been told about that is very often a serious exaggeration designed to confuse them about socialism and what socialism can do for them.
Mark, we have another caller.
All right, great.
Thanks for your comment.
Thank you very
Please
much.
call again.
Okay.
Tom, you're with us again.
Yeah, the main reason I called back is the caller who asked about Sinn Féin.
Yes.
And actually, that's something which I've been studying very intensively in the past 4 or 5 months. Just basically to answer his question, Republicanism is not really a monolithic idea. There are a lot of Republicans who are not socialists and who have rather conservative views, but the vast majority of Republicans are socialists in very much the same way that Richard Curtis is a socialist, or that Americans are socialists.
Tom, is that
they are concerned about the exploitation of workers. I mean, the vast majority of people in Sinn Féin and the IRA are working class people. Jerry Adams, who is currently the president of Sinn Féin, was a bartender before he became president of Sinn Féin. And they're also very concerned about unifying Catholic and Protestant workers. They're very concerned about expanding democracy, which really doesn't exist in Northern Ireland, and ending discrimination. They're very concerned about the exploitation of Ireland's resources by foreign companies, which is something that Jerry Adams has talked about a lot.
Tom.
Yeah.
We have run out of time on Hemispheres tonight, but we invite your call again, and we will pull together the show on the troubles in Ireland. Thanks for your comment.
Yeah, Tom, please watch for that show.
I will. Thanks.
Okay, thanks
Take
a
care.
lot. We're coming up on 7 o'clock at KGNU, and we're going to take a station identification break.
Well, actually, maybe we'll end with a little bit of music.